Peace, everyone. This is Curtis. Hope everyone's doing well. I know it's been a very stressful week for a lot of people out there, um, particularly for Black women. So, let me first say I'm sending lots of good vibes and energy to Black women out there, um, particularly to those who have experienced any type of domestic violence. It's a horrible thing. It's not something that is justifiable. It's something that is horrendous and, um, needs to be addressed. But, again, just sending a lot of love to Black women in particular who have experienced domestic violence, and or who know someone who experienced domestic violence. So let me first say that. Um, also let me send lots of love to people who do a lot of work with children's welfare, particularly Black children's welfare. There's been a long time war on Black children, and too many of our children die at the hands of their loved ones. This is something that is again horrific. It's not justifiable, and just sending lots of love to people dealing with that. And trigger warning: this show will talk about police genocide. It will talk about domestic violence. We'll talk about patriarchy, and we'll talk about trauma. So, but I feel as though this video is important and definitely necessary. So, there's been a lot. There's been several murders of Black women by the hands of their loved ones recently, and it's garnered a lot of attention. People talking about mental health. And of course, the frustrating thing whenever these incidents happen is that people tend to stick to their talking points. So, conservatives will stick to their talking points. See, Black men need to be locked up and throw away the key. Liberals will say, oh, it's the easy access to guns. Manosphere people will say, oh, it's these females. And you'll have, even some feminists who will say, this is about patriarchy, which, it is about patriarchy. But it's a little deeper than that. But I'm not dismissing a lot of the feminists what they're saying. Patriarchy is a driving factor. But there's some other issues that are tied into that, dealing with masculinity, and I'll be talking about that. But again, the frustrating thing is that people just stick to their talking points, and there's really not a deep interrogation of what the true root cause is. And oftentimes, these incidents kind of legitimize state violence, particularly state violence against Black men. Because in this case, literally, you had the police referring to the Shreveport mass shooting in which the gentleman, killed 8 children, and proceeded to shoot his current partner, I think his ex-partner, and then was on a police chase where the police literally shot him when he was in a moving vehicle, which they're not supposed to do. And they're trying to act like, oh, he might have died of self-inflicted. They're putting out that narrative in the media, lying. But it was another case of police genocide. But this is another situation where, the police look like the heroes, the good guys with the guns. So, the whole incident was just disturbing on so many levels. But first, when I first heard about it, there was a really excellent book that I read. I will put the link in the show description. It was dealing with violence, a deadly epidemic. And what the book was talking about, how essentially, men in this country are expected to be violent. We live in a strong culture of violence, which gets promoted to men. There's easy access to guns, and that a lot of men, they actually experience shame. And this shame, them feeling like they're inferior or feeling like they're not man enough, is what triggers them to redeem themselves and to engage in these very lethal acts of violence. And the book is by James Gilligan. He's a psychiatrist who studied a lot of people in the prison system who, were there for domestic violence, for pretty much killing their entire families. Fascinating book that I read several years ago. And it talked about pretty much the roots of male violence. And, one of the most fascinating things that it said in the book is that, it said that, if you're a man that kills 8 people, you'll go to prison. If you're if you're a man that kills 800 people, you'll become like, CEO of a major corporation. And if you kill 8 million people, become the president of the United States. And literally that's what's been going on. We have a president, the epitome of patriarchy, a pedophile, rapist, sociopath, white supremacist, scumbag who, has bombed close to about 200 schoolgirls in the quest to steal Iran's oil. Of course, they've incorporated a lot of wokeness and concern for humanitarianism. Oh, Iran oppresses women and they're killing their protesters, when the United States has literally hundreds of protesters in prisons right now. A lot of them are known as political prisoners, people who voiced how America was racist, was genocidal, people who fought for Puerto Rican independence, for Black liberation, for Native independence, and they're in prison. So that's bullshit. But essentially, right now we have a president engaging in mass killings. We have, even before that, this president engaged in mass killings in Venezuela. You had special forces go in there and kidnap a president and his wife and beat the woman up and then brought her to a prison where I think Maduro is currently in solitary confinement, which is a form of torture. So, we're living in an age of where extremely violent, extremely predatory masculinity is being propped up on the highest fucking level. On the highest level. Along with that, a lot of services are being cut. Tax breaks are being given to the rich. So inequality is just going up dramatically, which is one of the other root cause of violence in this country, particularly, men's violence, is income inequality. The more income inequality you have within a society, the more men are going to be violent. So that was a huge factor in this killing, is just income inequality. Another factor is the military. Most mass shooters in this country have military backgrounds. I'll say that again. Most mass shooters in this country have military backgrounds. Now, you might ask, well, that's an interesting tidbit. How come the media doesn't talk about this? Well, media doesn't talk about it because America is a military dictatorship. And the media is a propaganda arm of the military-industrial complex. And they don't want any criticisms of the military. Just like you have films, which Hollywood puts out, which show the military as saving us from aliens and being these heroic figures. The military literally writes those films. So a lot of the media that we consume in this country is literally made by the military. So of course, you're not going to see any criticisms of the military and or the military-industrial complex within the American media system. And, and this is kind of like bipartisan, because even on the left, you have people like, oh, we need to support our vets, and, and the vets are, they're not bad guys, they're caught up in these foreign wars by these politicians. And again, sometimes I hear people say that, but then, I don't hear that same criticism for the IDF. I hear people in the IDF are just genocidal maniacs. But American soldiers, they're just victims of a US political system. Which, okay, I can hear that, but they're also genocidal maniacs too. They are war criminals. And they are taught by the military to be war criminals. And the military shames these men because there are people in the military who oftentimes were concerned about the level of civilians that are being killed and went to their commanders, and their commanders called them pussies. And that's one of the things that you learn from reading this book by James Gilligan is that sexism and homophobia are very powerful, very, very powerful causes of male violence. Think about that. You shame men, you call them punks and F-bombs and pussies and B-words. You could get them to commit war crimes. And that's what the military does. The military trains people to be genocidal maniacs. And the culture we live in, which glorifies violence, glorifies male violence, glorifies war criminals, salutes pedophiles and rapists and enslavers and genocidal maniacs, salutes Confederates, people who tried to keep black women, under sex trafficking and tried to continue the mass raping of black women. There's close to about 2,000 Confederate monuments that are still in this country. And a lot of them are protected by law. Trump is bringing them back. So, we live in a culture of just horrific mass male violence. And for a lot of these men, particularly for black men, there's a lot of trauma. One of the shooter's friends talked about how the military fucked him up, which the military does. Men join the military one way, they might have, been do-gooders, people who actually believe that the military actually had some benefit to society. And, and that the military was actually about protecting freedom and all this other bullshit, which they shoved down our throats. But then, you get traumatized, you get yelled at, you get beat up, you get raped. There are close to about 500,000 man-on-man rapes in the military as a result of patriarchy, because the military is a very hierarchical institution. And these men don't get treatment for these sexual assaults. The military acts like it doesn't exist. They cover up women's sexual assaults. So, of course, they're going to cover up male sexual assaults. And if you bring this up, then, you must have wanted it. You're an F-bomb. What did you do? Are you secretly gay? Because the military is an extremely homophobic institution and also extremely sexist, which is the reason why, as Pete Hegseth, or Dead Seth says, the military these days is about maximum lethality. His words. He doesn't want to hear anything about wokeness and about protecting civilians. Maximum lethality. Pretty horrific stuff. What he means by that is maximum genocide. So the military was a major factor in this killing. Of course, patriarchy. One of the things that the book talks about is that, again, we live in a society based upon male domination. And when men, feel rejected or have their manhood challenged, I know this individual was going through a divorce, then they tend to lash out. So patriarchy definitely plays a major role. And of course, within the system of patriarchy, you have sexism. So as I mentioned, a lot of mass shooters are, previously have incidents of domestic violence, which is another interesting tidbit, which, the media does not tend to focus on because, of course, America is a very patriarchal society. Of course, The reason why, we continue to elect these predators instead of very qualified women, regardless of what you feel about some of those women's, individual policies. So you have military, you have masculinity. And another thing, there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. Masculinity is toxic because masculinity is based upon domination of women, domination of other men who you believe who are inferior to you. It's based upon homophobia. It's based upon violence. It's based upon treating women and children as commodities. It's based upon, working yourself to death, provide and protect, but the provide and protect is based upon controlling women. It's not based upon some valiant, oh, I just want to be a good provider, and do right by my family. No, it's based, I want to provide so I can control. And I want to protect because, women and children are my property. So masculinity is toxic. No such thing as, toxic masculinity. The whole concept, which is, it's man-made. Gender is man-made. Manhood is man-made. Masculinity is man-made. And a lot of these masculine norms of, domination, control, violence, anger, suppression of feelings, homophobia, not taking care of oneself. It's all socially programmed. It's the product of living within a toxic society. And again, this masculinity now, like I said, it's being, this and some of these manosphere people, they swear that masculinity is on the decrease because of feminism. They swear that masculinity is under attack. What they really mean is white men are under attack. But these manosphere people are trying to take us back to 19th century. As far as pretty much, they openly say they want to put women in their place. But, that also means that men are going to be put in their place too. So if you're a man, biologically, you don't want to fight in some of these forever wars for oil, hey, you'll be put to death. So, and then the other thing, to be added is trauma. Black men in this country experience a lot of trauma, a lot of structural violence. Mental health and mental health concerns, I know about because I have been, a 16-year sufferer of mental health problems. One of the most significant ones being OCD. OCD is directly related to trauma. And a lot of trauma can be generational. But, when a person has mental health concerns, that usually is indication that they had significant trauma. And that trauma usually occurs through, abuse and or structural violence. So, Black men in this country, we come into the world and, we're immediately have our genitals mutilated via circumcision. Trauma. We get spanked by our loved ones. Trauma. And Black boys, have very, very, Black boys tend to experience more corporal punishment than Black girls do. And even in schools. So like he's from Louisiana. In Louisiana, corporal punishment is still, something that is widely encouraged. I think there are close to about 200,000 children, most of whom are poor, Black and or disabled, who get paddled as if they are enslaved to this day in the mostly Confederate states. And, because Louisiana is very, Christian and they want to put the Bible in schools, these Christians who are white supremacists, because Christianity is sanctified white supremacy, they don't want to ban anything biblical, and beating children is biblical. So Black men experience this. Black men oftentimes experience sexual violence, sometimes at the hands of men and women. You had a situation where the African Bambaataa was accused of sexually trafficking boys. So a lot of men, a lot of Black boys, they get sexually assaulted. More trauma. Black boys get targeted and criminalized in school. More trauma. Black people, when they join, black women, they join the military, they experience racism. More trauma. They might experience sexual assault or bullying. More trauma. So essentially, black men are the most oppressed group in this country. I know that's controversial. Some people are like, oh no, it's black women, it's black trans. And again, I'm not saying black women, black trans people do not experience oppression. They do. When you look at the data, you look at the levels of mass incarceration, the levels of police genocide, the levels of capital punishment, corporal punishment, the unemployment rates. I know they've been talking a lot about the massive amounts of black women who are currently unemployed. It's about close to about 100,000 more for black men. I think it's roughly, I don't know, maybe 500,000 black women unemployed, or I think it's 100,000 more for black men. And again, the fact that black men are targeted doesn't mean that patriarchy isn't real. Black men are targeted because of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Black men are oppressed for that reason. And that's what some black men, particularly some of the black men who advocate for black male studies and, who promote some of the very prominent work of Dr. Tommy Curry, what they don't, they oftentimes have a lot of smoke for feminists, but they don't have any smoke for patriarchy. They don't have any smoke for these male chauvinist murder cults. Because as I said, black boys are beaten because of a male murder chauvinist cult. Black men are put to death because of male murder chauvinist cults. The death penalty, that's all wrapped up in Christianity. Death penalty, that's Christianity. Corporal and capital punishment, those are two things. Christianity. Circumcision, again, due to a male murder chauvinist cults. Islam, Christianity, Judaism. That's why, men are getting their genitals mutilated. It's like some type of blood ritual. It's insane. It's unacceptable that this still happens. But when people try to oppose it, oh, it's, you're trying to restrict my religion. So black men, have experienced a lot of trauma, and I can resonate with that. I myself have experienced a lot of trauma. I have experienced domestic violence at the hands, of loved ones. I have experienced racist bullying. I have been called the N-word probably, more than I can count, mostly up north. I have suffered with mental illness. I was undiagnosed with mental illness. And again, to be clear, the mental illness is not what the cause of the violence is, it's the trauma. Because if you read the book by James Gilligan, you'll learn that most of these men that he dealt with, were experienced horrific abuse. They oftentimes were locked in closets for days. They were, just experienced just extreme levels of physical abuse. So, a lot of the black men in our community who are committing a lot of these heinous acts, they come from certain backgrounds. They're mostly poor, they're mostly disadvantaged, and very much abused and or military. Because again, the military, that's what they want. They train you. So, it's like, garbage in, garbage out. Most people don't, most military people can't separate, oh, I'm not in Iraq no more. I'm not in the battlefield. No, they're taught to use violence. They're taught how to use weapons. So the battlefield comes home. That's why military people have some of the highest rates of domestic violence. And rape culture is just, is through the roof in the military. It's so bad that they cover it up. there's a really good book called The Fort Bragg Cartel. I mean, just the levels of criminality in the military these days is just like it's just ridiculous. So, when I found out about the shooting, I was like, yeah, he was probably military. Lo and behold, it was confirmed. And then, to wrap this up, talk about police genocide. So there has been, there are people who are understandably rightfully upset. Women, black women, people who advocate for black children who are rightfully upset about, some of the acts that have taken place. And I'm upset, and you should be upset. Anger is a good thing. And I would just, and I understand with that sometimes with that level of upset, along with the fact that oftentimes, that predatory men do not get held to account, i.e., Diddy, Bill Cosby, etc. There's oftentimes, a desire for vengeance, which, the state supports, because the state, they're not in the business of rehabilitation. So, let me say this. All this domestic violence is not going away anytime soon because it's too fucking profitable. I'll say that again. All this domestic violence and violence against women and children, it's not going away anytime soon because it's too fucking profitable. The gun companies make money. The big pharma will make money under the guise of, well, we got treat people for mental health, when oftentimes their drugs cause violence. The prison systems make money. The police make money. The politicians make money. The media makes money. Everybody's making money. So when money is to be made, problems will not be solved. That's how this works. So domestic violence not going away in the black community under capitalism, not going away. It's too profitable. Violence, violence against women not going away, too profitable. There are whole entire industries, the pornography industry, that literally it's a $14 billion industry made glorifying violence against women. Hollywood, all these horror films and, movies glorifying violence against women, $20 billion industry. So, violence against women, I mean, if you include the illicit sex trafficking, which literally props up whole entire economies, you're talking about $1 trillion fucking industry. And I'm not even including the military and all their violence against women. All of the, because essentially, whenever the military, one of the reasons why, these military people are stationed across the country is so, essentially the countries become like comfort women. So during World War II, when Japan was invading all these countries, they set up bases where the Japanese imperial troops were, pretty much they went to the country so they can just sexually assault the women. And this was done to boost morale. So it works the same way with the US military. We have all these 1,000 bases across the world. And, the military, they intentionally send the troops over there so the men can sexually assault women. This is documented in the book Base Nation. And there was a recent lawsuit which talks about how the levels of sex trafficking and SA are at horrific levels at some of these military bases. There's a lawsuit against the US military for facilitating this. So again, you have men going overseas to, sexually assault women. I mean, they're eventually going to come home, and what are they going to do here? Same thing. So I understand that a lot of people, they want vengeance, and the state, is happy to offer that. That's why, this cop, it was definitely unjustifiable murder. He was fleeing in a car. He wasn't a threat to the cop. At the time, he wasn't a threat to anybody. And they murdered him. It was another case of police genocide, because genocide is, the act of killing someone within, it's a matter of killing someone within a marginalized group. It doesn't have to be mass killings like it is in Palestine. It could just be like killing one person. And the police have a history of racism and white supremacy. So, you know, carceral feminism is not the solution. And I appreciate a lot of the abolitionist feminists out there who have been advocating, who approach this issue of domestic violence and, some of the violence that you see from men in a very compassionate and holistic manner of realizing that the police, who are huge domestic abusers, the prison system, which again is filled with domestic abusers, like these systems, which are predicated upon, enslavement, rape, torture, and white supremacy, are not the solution to some of the legitimate problems that we have in the Black community. Particularly amongst some men who, are engaging in this violence. So shout out to them. But I just wanted to just notate that, because there was another case of here in Atlanta where a gentleman, another military veteran, he was in the Navy, went on just like a mass shooting spree, killed a Black woman, a DHS agent who was white, and I think another white man. And he was found in DeKalb County Jail. They killed him pretty much. They said, "Oh yeah, we found him unresponsive," but those guards, because he killed a white DSS agent, murdered him. So, so again, I mean, and again, as with all things human related, violence is a cycle. And that's why, it is important that people who care about these things, we have to challenge, we have to push back against corporal punishment. We have to push back against capital punishment. We have to push back against structural violence and against inequality and against patriarchy and against sexualized patriarchy. Because a lot of patriarchy now is sexualized. It's, it's something where, it's eroticized, so yeah, a lot of men these days, they're watching pornography, in which women are getting their hair pulled, getting smacked and getting spit on. And this, in some circles, is like, oh, this is sexually liberation, according to some sex positive feminists. So a lot of patriarchy now is sexualized. So we must push back on all these forms of violence and against the culture of violence, which in particular now is targeting Black men. We must push back against the manosphere, against all this, toxic masculinity, alpha male, all this other bullshit, even coming from some notable conscious Black people. We must push back against homophobia. We must push back against all this because all this is toxic and it's literally destroying our communities. And men who have experienced harm, it's okay to get help. And we must also recognize that, yes, anti-Black misandry is a thing. Black men are targeted, but that does not mean that all these other things cannot be true. And we must push back against that as well. No more of, of telling our boys to man up. Maybe, discourage them to get away from football, because again, it's encouraging aggression, it's brain damage. Discourage them from getting involved in contact sports because again, it's aggression. Encourage more of our boys to be intellectuals, to read, to be in nature, to learn about what it means to be anti-sexist, to learn about, Black freedom fighters, to learn about, all of the years of resistance, that Black men have had to the U.S. empire. Discourage them from being cops and joining the military and from being a part of these genocidal death squads who only encourage more violence in our communities. So that's it. I'll put some links in the show description. Again, my heart goes out to all the victims and to their families. My heart does go out to the families of those people who lost the children. And my heart also goes out to, some of the brothers who are experiencing pain and, and who have been, severely abused and unfortunately have not been able to get the help that they need. I'm not justifying their behavior. I'm not excusing the harm they've caused. One thing I've learned is that yes, black men, we, a lot of us do get victimized. We are victimized, but we also can be the victimizer. We also can cause harm, and that's not something that should be ignored or dismissed. And a lot of reasons why we cause harm is because we've been indoctrinated into patriarchy. We've been indoctrinated into all these, into this notion of manhood. You got to be a real man, got to be an alpha man, all this other nonsense. So again, I just, sending lots of love to everyone. Please like this video, share it, subscribe, have more content coming. I'm going to be dealing with that toxic manosphere. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your night. Peace.